Hi everybody, welcome for everybody here in person and then those online. My name is Jenna-Lee Saralogas. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Director of Advancement and Alumni Relations at Knox College. Thank you for joining us today as part of the University of Toronto's Alumni Reunion. These gatherings offer an opportunity to reconnect with members of our community, explore new ideas, and celebrate the ongoing intellectual and spiritual life of Knox College. This morning, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Robert Revington to present his lecture, Under a Very Heavy Cloud of Suspicion, Great Debates in Canadian Biblical Studies and Theology at the Turn of the Century. Dr. Revington's relationship with Knox College dates to his doctoral studies here, during which he was the recipient of the John A. Mackenzie Scholarship, established through the generosity of the Ralph M. Barford Foundation. And since that time, his academic work has continued to contribute to ongoing conversations in his field. And we are grateful for the opportunity to hear from him today. One of the strengths of a theological college is its ability to foster rigorous inquiry and thoughtful dialogue. And public lectures such as this one provide an important space for engaging ideas, asking questions, and learning together. Thank you all for being here this morning, both in person and online. And we look forward to this morning's lecture and the conversations that it will inspire. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Revington.
Thank you, Sash and Jenna-Lee, for helping make this happen, and thank you to all of you for coming, both in person and online. So, let me begin. Since debating clubs were popular at the turn of the century, in 1894, students from Montreal Diocesan Theological College held a friendly debate against a local society for mutual improvement. The debate was on whether giving women higher education was a bad idea because it would make them unfit for household duties. Their wording, not mine. Now, you'll be pleased to know that the theology students won the debate. And afterwards, the college's magazine commented that their students believe in the higher education, but not in the higher criticism. Just as women's rights would be a recurring debate in Canada in the decades that follow, the same could be said about higher criticism or modern biblical scholarship. In lectures, sermons, journal articles, books, and other venues, discussions about the legitimacy of higher critical approaches to the Bible were ubiquitous in this era. In 1900, even an advertisement for a tailor shop in Halifax referenced the debate over higher criticism. The ad said, "Higher criticism may or may not be all right, but concerning the criticisms which are passed on the garments we make, we are quite satisfied with them, as well satisfied as the people who patronize us are with their overcoats or suits." References to higher criticism appeared in other media beyond that, including popular writing. In 1888, the Trinity University Review in Toronto noted that more and more popular religious novels were being published. Yet the author initially questioned whether the pressing religious issues of the era lent themselves to good fiction, writing, "One is inclined to wonder how such subjects as the authenticity of the Pentateuch, the genuineness of the Book of Daniel, materialism, rationalism, and the numerous other isms of the day can be made the groundwork of an interesting plot." Even so, he admitted, when one considers that fortunately religion has the greatest hold on man's life, that the beliefs of man are the dearest and most important of his possessions, one can readily see how the spectacle of a mind rent by perplexity and a soul tormented by fever offers such a field for the imaginative and descriptive powers that a practiced novelist is not slow to take advantage of. Ultimately, discussions about higher criticism did influence some popular media in Canada. In one case, in 1894, G.J. Lowe printed the text of a play dramatization of the Song of Solomon in the Queen's Quarterly. In his preface, Lowe said of his subject, "Whatever sins the higher criticism may be charged with, at least this much should be placed to its credit. that it has made one book of the Holy Scriptures more intelligible and given it an ethical value which it lacked before. He noted that the higher criticism has emphasized the idea that it, Song of Solomon, was not written by, but about King Solomon. Thanks to this insight, Lowe believed that modern critics have transfigured the song from a merely amatory ode with no apparent aim save a sensual one into a dramatic piece with a highly moral motive, because the poem, in his view, filled a want which seemed to be lacking in the Hebrew Bible before, a commendation of pure connubial love. Lowe felt that if Solomon did not write the Song of Solomon, it improved that book because it depicted pure love. But with all of his hundreds of wives and concubines, he wondered what Solomon could really know of this pure love. As Lowe put it, fancy Juliet being wooed by Romeo to become one of a whole lot of wives, or Desdemona, or Imogen, or Rosalind. Indeed, import the idea of polygamy into any one of Shakespeare's plays and you ruin it. And we may say the same of the creation of any of our great English poets. So if the higher critics denied that Solomon wrote the book, Lowe believed this elevated the book's portrayal of love, since this meant it was not written by someone with so many wives and concubines. Other literary works in this era also addressed higher criticism. For example, in his 1895 poetry collection, Motley, Canadian cartoonist J.W. Bengough included a poem titled The Higher Criticism. Bengough suggests that for all their learning, smug higher critics would never understand the essence of the Bible like a simple believer. In the poem, a patronizing higher critic says of those with traditional views, "Such simple faith is touching, yet 'tis also very sad, when modern doubts and theories are so cheaply to be had. And I feel a sense of duty impelling me to state that Genesis is clearly of a post-exilic date." Bengough's fictional critic goes on to chide his hearer for taking narratives in Genesis' history or accepting Davidic authorship of the Psalms. Nonetheless, in the poem, Bengough contrasts the higher critic with his mother and says, "But she was a higher critic of the very highest kind. She searched the scriptures daily, the pearl of price to find. She caught their inner spirit, which some higher critics miss, and Christ was formed within her and filled her soul with bliss." Bengough concludes, "I have no quarrel with learning. Wise doctors have their place, but the scalpel of the scholar cannot dissect God's grace." Later, with more comedic intent, in December 1908, the Toronto journalist J.E. Middleton wrote a satirical poem on the subject for Acta Victoriana, Victoria College's student journal. The poem was titled The Higher Criticism and was dedicated with fear and trembling to the incipient sons of thunder known as the first year in theology. The poem was a parody of higher criticism that supposedly applied its methods not to the Bible, but to the nursery rhyme Old Mother Hubbard. As Middleton put it, "So we examine it, scalpel in hand, microscope near, ready placed on its stand." In his poetic exegesis, Middleton found a problem with Old Mother Hubbard. Who keeps in cupboards the bones for a pup? Really, this writer should straighten things up. Middleton's parody of higher criticism also questioned if she was really a mother at all, whether she existed, or if her name might have been Clancy or Wiggins instead. Hence, he ended the poem, "There is no evidence elsewhere we're certain, save in the poem, so ring down the curtain. Put out the lights with a hurried apology. Old Mother Hubbard is merely mythology." Canadian newspapers could have different slants on higher criticism. On this point, in 1922, W.G. Jordan, a longtime professor at Queen's in Kingston, judged that the Toronto Globe, so far as represented by unsigned articles and reviews, appears to represent the traditional view with the suggestion that modern scholarship is steeped in skepticism. Later, in 1929, Jordan compared the portrayal of biblical criticism in the Montreal Star to the Globe. He reflected that the Star's treatment of religion was thoughtful and well-written, while editorials in the Globe were much more dogmatic in their understanding of biblical scholarship and literalistic in their reading of the Bible. When discussing the Globe's endorsement of a literal reading of Genesis 1, Jordan concluded, "The Globe may be liberal and independent in other things, but in this region it is neither." As far as I know, it is not the editorial policy of its successor, the Globe and Mail, today to read Genesis literally. Some Canadian books on the Bible at the turn of the century could rightly be described as weird by more modern standards. For instance, in 1879, the Canadian Methodist minister W.H. Poole published a book arguing that the Anglo-Saxons of his era were really descended from the lost tribes of Israel. He reiterated this belief in an 1889 title. A review in the Canadian Methodist Quarterly described this book as more speculative than practical, with arguments more fanciful than logical, even if the author's labors were exhaustive. In 1891, W.H. Withrow diplomatically stated, "Whether one accept this theory or not, he cannot but admit the ingenuity and force with which its able advocates urge his contention." Likewise, Joseph Wilde, a former professor at Albert College, a Methodist college in Belleville, Ontario, published a book titled The Lost 10 Tribes in 1882. He concluded, "In the belief that the Saxons are the 10 lost tribes of Israel, I am more and more confirmed." He also discussed biblical prophecy and offered the following matter-of-fact conclusions. From about 1880 or 1882, England will possess Jerusalem. In the 12th chapter of Daniel, 11th verse, we find 30 days added to the 1,260, making it 1,290. These added 30 years denote the time England will have to contend for her right to Palestine. It will finally be acknowledged, however, by all nations. In 1935, the Battle of Armageddon will end, but Palestine will not be fully settled down to a peaceful possession till 1957. Then the government will be fully established and acknowledged all over the world. These predictions were not 100% accurate. Indeed, reflecting the language of the time, he also printed a work titled Whence Came the Negro Race? He maintains that since the biblical Adam's name means red, all people, both black and white, are descended from a red ancestor and have different skin colors because of environmental factors, so therefore may we treat one another as brothers, knowing that we have a common destiny and the same great Savior. Now, most people who studied the Bible in 19th and 20th century, early 20th century Canada, were studying to be pastors and lived regimented lives in the service of the church. Ministers or future ministers who were reluctant to do mission work in frigid conditions in Western Canada were not viewed sympathetically by leaders in their denominations. One example is James Robertson. From 1881 to 1902, Robertson was the Presbyterian Church in Canada's superintendent of missions in Western Canada. In other words, he was responsible for overseeing the church's growth in the West and finding ministers to fill mission charges. In 1890, Robertson wrote an article in the Knox College Monthly and Presbyterian magazine titled Men for Frontier Service, where he says harsh things about those who were unwilling to join him in Western Canada for mission work. He condemned those who objected to the cold climate in places such as Manitoba because he said it would only, for 2 or 3 months, be severe. Robertson also said that the climate does not deter the farmer or mechanic, the lawyer or the medical man, and surely ministers will not offer the climate as an excuse. He was likewise unsympathetic to those who complained about the money for such work and suggested they were ungrateful, even while admitting they weren't always paid promptly. And he wrote, "Salaries are not luxurious, but they compare favorably with the average in Ontario, and they're higher than the average of other denominations. But are they always paid? Not always. But if a minister is efficient, he has no need to fear for his salary. And if he is not, arrears are apt to accumulate anywhere. Why this higgling about salaries? Young men are supposed to have few expenses." Other things about student life outside the classroom have changed over time. Though they had heavy workloads, students nonetheless found some time for recreation. In the college journals of the era, there are many articles about theology students competing in sports such as soccer, hockey, or basketball against other colleges or local teams, much more so than at theological colleges today. There are other things about students' lives that are taken for granted now, but could not have been in past eras. In 1893, the Manitoba College Journal received a letter to the editor asking why students could not be given access to a single telephone for the entire campus. Before the age of the internet, magazines gave students something to read for pleasure and were greatly in demand. To that end, a short but bitter note in a January 1906 piece in the Presbyterian College Journal in Montreal complained that whichever student was hogging all the magazines from the college's reading room deserved to be sent back to kindergarten for his childishness, or perhaps to reform school or even jail to correct this behavior, for it was high time that an example be made of one or more of these moral degenerates. Even relative to other fields in colleges and universities, the demographics of the seminaries or theological colleges changed more slowly. Those who entered the ministry in Canada in the 19th century and into the early 20th century were mostly white men. An 1897 editorial in the Presbyterian College Journal said women should not take a full theology course in the denomination because the teaching we receive is intended to make us men, to make us true men, to fit us to take a man's place in life. Do not then ask women to take such a course, but give them such teaching as will enable them to become truer women and prepare them to take a woman's place in life. At times, women were viewed as a distraction or even obstacle for future theology students. In a milder example, a poem in the January 1890 issue of the Manitoba College Journal criticized the college's theology students for being too focused on women during their theological studies and even getting married. As the poem put it, "We are a noble crowd of youth who learn divinity, and yet there lingers still some dross which must discarded be. For verily we human are, and this I soon can prove, by showing how some do repair and some do fall in love. For truly when I think it o'er, the latter are as bad as were the wicked dauntless for to wed who courage had." The next verse may sound more sinister to the modern reader than intended at the time, but nonetheless, the poem says this excessive interest in women extended to when the theology students attended the local church. "And when at Knox Church we are found, I have been grieved to see that long as theologues are round, no girl alone can be. And when they start their homeward way, e'en then they are pursued, and each will rustle forth to snatch a chicken from the brood." The poem concluded, "To all the theologues I say, let's wait till we are through, till right the reverend we may, and then such things we'll do. Then we'll all be up and wooing, seeking for a proper mate. Still proposing, still pursuing, make the other fellows wait." In a harsher example, in 1890, Robertson also had strong words about future Presbyterian clergy who got married before completing their degrees. As he put it, "Of the students applying to the Home Mission Committee of the General Assembly last spring for appointment, no fewer than 6 in one class from one college had printed in brackets after their names, 'Married.' And there is reason to believe that 6 did not exhaust the number. That the proportion was so large is due to the laxness of the church." Robertson was concerned that a man would need to prioritize his family, and this would limit which church or mission charges he could accept. He asked, "Is this just to the idea of the ministry of Jesus Christ, or true to the church or to the man? Unless blessed with more cash than belongs to most students, the young theologian cannot afford to get married. For those who did get married," he said, "scholarship, manhood, and efficiency are all apt to suffer through this pernicious practice." Robertson added, any man marrying during his college course should be told by the General Assembly that the doors of her colleges were closed against him, because the lack of good judgment and self-restraint on his part augured ill for his future usefulness. This is the course adopted by the Methodist Church with good effect, and there is no reason why the Presbyterian Church should not adopt it. For these remarks, the Manitoba College Journal criticized Robertson for seeming to say that future ministers should be celibate. Although even the writer in the Manitoba College Journal said he did not approve of theology students getting married too soon, that writer was nonetheless broad-minded enough to say that we do know cases where neither scholarship nor manhood nor efficiency suffered when theology students got married. What is striking about Robertson's article is how much control he believed the church should have over their students' lives, not only during, but in the years directly following their studies. For someone like Robertson, personal sacrifices should be expected to serve the larger goal of spreading the gospel. Now, what about higher criticism itself? In many ways, debates over higher criticism presented two dueling visions of Christian apologetics. Those who opposed higher criticism saw themselves as defending the faith from liberal modernistic theology. Yet the other side also believed they were defending the faith. Generally, Canada's strongest advocates for modern higher criticism believed that it served the cause of Christian apologetics by making Christianity and the Bible more intelligible to modern minds that could no longer interpret the Bible as infallible. Now, did it belong in preaching? In 1895, in the Montreal Diocesan Theological College Journal, a Montreal businessman and lay Christian named George Haig published an article for theology students where he advised that sermons should be interesting. And so he said, questions of scholastic disputation and criticism should be avoided, because even if students and scholars found such questions interesting, congregations as a rule do not care for them. In the next issue, Haig added that too often a young preacher will think it adds to his importance to tell his congregation there are considerable doubts amongst scholars as to whether the text he preaches from is genuine, or whether the book was written by the prophet whose name it bears. Using the names of imaginary scholars, Haig imagined such a preacher citing the authority of the learned Upsetter, who in the 29th folio volume of his abridged writings, page 182, has some critical remarks on the subject, which, however, it is only fair to say are called in question by Professor Standfaster, who is of the opinion the passage is genuine. The learned Bookworm, however, coming after both, is unable to come to any authoritative conclusions on the matter. Haig advised ministers that if they ever include such learned nonsense in their sermons, your congregation will begin to yawn, and the more sensible of them will say, if the passage is not genuine, why do you preach from it? Well, Standsetter, Upsetter, and other learned dreamers might spin out their theories like a silkworm in a cocoon. Haig said that for most laity, life is too short and the business of life too serious for us to trouble ourselves about them. Joseph Leeman Gilmore, a future McMaster University professor, discussed higher criticism in an 1893 book review. Gilmore wrote, "It is clear that those who are not higher critics must either honestly examine the subject or else say nothing about it and confine themselves to those aspects of religion of which no higher criticism can rob them." He gave a warning to the critics themselves. To no class of men today does Paul's exhortation to speak the truth in love apply more fully than to these men of so-called advanced views. Cruelly to tear to pieces good, pious people's beliefs about the Bible merely for the pleasure of seeing something fly to atoms is ungentlemanly, not to say unchristian. Gilmore also lamented the negative impact that higher criticism had on the younger generation's faith, saying, "Many of the younger men of the present time have no doubt felt that their knowledge of the Bible has not been as good as that of their fathers. The reason seems to be that there had been, just before their time, a sort of collapse. The old theories since then have been only timidly held, while the new ones have rested under a very heavy cloud of suspicion. As in Gilmore's article, one of the most frequently discussed questions involving higher criticism was whether it should be rejected because it undermined the authority of the Bible and the Christian faith. As far back as 1848, Knox College professor Michael Willis expressed suspicion of a torrent of wild and licentious criticism, as well as philosophy, which threatened to sap the foundations of Christianity. In 1882, the Presbyterian College Journal printed a letter from a reader, likely an active minister, who said, "I do not see that liberal theology, as it is taught by some, can make headway for good anywhere. After trying it for years, I have quite fallen out with it. It cripples religious energy and lets spirituality die a natural death." This letter writer added, "I am through the fog and find myself bowing before the grand old truths of the gospel in their own clear, bright light." As I've alluded to a bit already, in the 1890s, the Montreal Diocesan Theological College was particularly hostile to higher criticism. In 1892, in the first issue of that college's magazine, the college's principal, Canon William Henderson, wrote an article comparing higher critics to the snake in the Garden of Eden, because both made people question what God told them, though in the critics' case, they made people question how God spoke throughout the Bible. Henderson added, "These men are literally tearing the Bible to pieces with fearless and, may I not say it, sacrilegious hands." According to Henderson, by questioning Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, Davidic authorship of some Psalms, and the historicity of various narratives, the critics would undermine people's faith in the Bible and say in many respects what the tempter said of old, "Yea, hath God said?" Likewise, Henderson said that the critics made their claims with an overconfidence and a dogmatism of assertion which finds its parallel only in the assurances of the tempter of old, when he allayed the fears of Eve with the words, "Ye shall not surely die. Ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." Henderson writes that the key distinction was that for Satan to do his work now, it is not serpents that are employed to do his destructive work, but instead, he does it by means of scholars and ecclesiastics of deservedly high repute, because these people were the higher critics. Although he believed that such higher critics were partially under the guidance of the evil one, he did not believe they were necessarily ungodly or reprobate men, no more than Eve was an ungodly woman when she listened to the voice of the charmer and involved herself and her descendants after her in irretrievable ruin. Still, Henderson believed there was room for legitimate biblical criticism because, as he put it, was there no fruit for our first parents in Eden? Plenty of fruit, but not the forbidden fruit. Criticism has its proper place in the science of theology, but not the criticism which destroys what it ought to preserve. Not everyone went as far as him in associating higher criticism with Satan, though. Nonetheless, when the Bishop of Huron, Maurice Baldwin, visited this same college in Montreal in 1895, in a lecture he condemned the growth of infidelity and rationalism in schools and colleges, along with the teaching of false and damnable doctrines concerning God's word. He then said, "Destroy the Bible and you unloose the dogs of war." The school of the higher, but rather the lower, criticism is one of these forces today. An article in the college's magazine endorsed the bishop's views and said, "The attitude which the church at large will finally assume towards the views of the higher critics is yet a matter of interesting conjecture, and no doubt depends largely upon the lengths to which they will carry them. But the position taken by his lordship, the position of uncompromising repudiation, is the safest, the most honorable the church can assume." This was because he believed any attempt at compromise with the higher critics would seem to imply on the part of the church a recognition of some truth in their position. Similar sentiments can be found elsewhere. A June 1890 article in the Acadia Athenaeum stated, "We believe that so long as Acadia remains an exponent and defender of biblical principles, so long will prosperity attend her ways." Yet what did this mean? According to the Athenaeum, amidst the loud and pretentious claims of free thought and so-called higher criticism in the intellectual world, there appears to be reasonable grounds for our affirming that in this institution of learning at least, the Bible is recognized to be our chief cornerstone, uncorroded as yet by the malignant acidity of ambitious skepticism. For this writer at Acadia, higher criticism appeared to be synonymous with skepticism and a rejection of the Bible. Other Christians were open to higher criticism to an extent, but were cautious. In 1898, an Ontario minister named G.D. Baines compared using higher criticism to riding a bicycle on Sunday. As Baines put it, the Sunday bicycle is a useful institution when it is employed in bringing people to church, but not when it brings them the other way. So he applied the same logic to higher criticism. Discussions of higher criticism in this era were closely linked to whether it helped or harmed the cause of the church. This was the case for both opponents and supporters of it. Yet in Canada and other countries, by the early 20th century, for the mainline seminaries, biblical criticism was not seen as an obstacle to Christian faith or associated with irreligion in many cases. On the contrary, it served the aim of Christian apologetics by providing a way to dispose of difficult texts in the Hebrew Bible. It wasn't necessarily associated with skepticism. In 1936, the Cambridge scholar Stanley A. Cook summarized the sentiments of many mainline Christian scholars of his era when he wrote, "Biblical criticism has sometimes held to be at least partly responsible for modern skepticism, loss of faith, and moral decay, although, on the other hand, there are those who know that it has lessened or removed their doubts and difficulties." Though not just talking about English-speaking scholarship, as William A. Beardsley puts it, liberal Protestant thought in the 19th century was much concerned to find a definition of Christianity that would be acceptable and comprehensible in terms of the secular thought of the day. Biblical criticism provided a way to do this. In the Presbyterian College Journal, R.E. Welsh observed in 1906 that in the New Testament field, even the advanced guard of critics, in using relentlessly the scientific historical method, are looking for some sifted form of faith. Most critics, even the extreme ones, were nonetheless trying to present a version of Christianity, but one that was coherent with their perception of a modern scientific worldview, even if not everyone shared their presuppositions. In the mainline Protestant English-speaking world especially, higher criticism was linked to the defense of Christianity. In an 1893 book, despite having many unorthodox ideas about the composition of the Bible for his era, the British scholar T.K. Chain wrote that biblical criticism was now necessary for the maintenance of true evangelical religion. This is consistent with many Canadian biblical critics. They used biblical criticism in the service of Christian apologetics to address problems with the Bible. So we see this in Canada. In 1903, the Queen's University professor James Capon praised Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany for supporting higher criticism in that country. Now, admittedly, not many people in Canada would be praising the Kaiser for anything just over a decade later. But the reasons Capon did so here are instructive. He explained, "The Kaiser is very well aware that the fabric of society must rest on some basis of religious faith. To preserve the Bible, therefore, as a vital element in modern life and thought is the important thing at this time. And the Kaiser has come to see that this is precisely what the higher criticism is doing. It is mediating between the reason of modern man and the capacity for faith which exists in him." Capon went on to argue that the growing acceptance of higher criticism in predominantly Protestant countries was a mark of the superiority of Protestantism over Catholicism, and why Protestants continued to have a vital religious faith. As Capon put it, we owe it to the higher criticism that the Bible has remained a living thing to us, and not, as it is to the mass of educated men in Italy and France, a collection of obsolete fables. Capon's words fit with the idea many people at the time held. Higher criticism served the cause of Christian apologetics by removing difficulties for enlightened 20th century Christian men. Yet it also served the cause of liberal Protestantism specifically. Similarly, in 1915, J.F. McLaughlin of Victoria College looked back on the preceding decades of Canadian biblical scholarship with these optimistic words. 30 years ago, the historical and critical methods of Bible study, while not by any means unknown, had made but little progress in England or in Canada, and had scarcely more than obtained a foothold in British and American universities. Now all is changed, and these methods are almost universally accepted. The fear of damaging results to faith is disappearing, and hostility is disarmed. Criticism has freed itself from some of its own extravagances and follies, and is no longer looked upon as an instrument of unbelief. Now, in his 2020 book on the history of religious scholarship in Canada, when Aaron W. Hughes discussed the arrival of higher criticism in Canada, he wrote, "Unlike religious believers, those who practiced higher criticism regarded the Bible not as the inerrant word of God, but instead as a fallible human document." But in isolation, this is a somewhat misleading statement, because in Canada, most people who practiced higher criticism in the 19th and early 20th centuries were religious believers, who nonetheless believed the Bible was divinely inspired, but maybe in a different way than past generations. Almost everyone who taught higher criticism in Canadian higher education was a Protestant of some kind. John Campbell of Presbyterian College, Montreal, was an outspoken critic of many higher critical conclusions. Yet even someone as dubious of higher criticism as him could write in 1900 that he was sure that many professors and ministers who have accepted some of the advanced views of the critics have done so after earnest prayer for divine illumination. Most mainline biblical scholars in Canada at the turn of the century endorsed the theology of progressive revelation, the idea that we gradually get a more complete view of God over time, from the time of the ancient Hebrews to the time of Jesus. This provided a way to dispose of more violent or seemingly primitive texts in the Hebrew Bible, but was also a way to cut the legs out of skeptical attacks on Christianity. Christian biblical scholars who accepted the insights of modern source criticism on the Pentateuch and things of that nature used their scholarship to defend the Bible, even if their conception of the Bible was different than many Christians had previously held. It provided an apologetic justification where the Bible didn't seem to fit with modern science, or for passages such as the Israelites' slaughter of the Canaanites. It's telling that in 1930, a student's article in the McMaster University Monthly said as an aside, "Many of us have failed to see any resemblance between the God revealed in Jesus Christ, who restored to life the widow's son and took the little children up in his arms and blessed them, and the God worshipped by the early Hebrews, a God whom one of their writers depicts as slaughtering the innocent babes of a nation." But the fact that a contrast was drawn with the God worshipped by the early Hebrews is significant. Progressive revelation did serve its ultimate purpose in bolstering the faith of early 20th century Canadians. W.G. Jordan of Queens was one of its leading exponents, and we know his work had a positive impact. A biography of Jordan records that a sentence from one of his worship services profoundly moved one of his hearers and became the working creed of that man's life. As the biography W.T. McCree put it in 1941, in this incident we see that the doctrine of progressive revelation, which had caught and anchored the faith of so many who had been drifting on the unknown sea of evolution, had gripped the soul of both preacher and hearer that day. The logic of progressive revelation was so characteristic of the era that could be applied to a variety of contexts. In 1895, a paper given at a missionary conference at Victoria College by J.D. Fitzpatrick attempted to construct the historical development of the missionary idea in the Bible. And he tried to find how the concept of missionary work was shown progressively throughout the Bible. Despite apparent anachronisms, he traced the concept of foreign missions as far back as Abraham's journeys in Genesis, and then Isaac, Jacob, Judah, Moses, and Joshua, David, Solomon, Jonah, and Isaiah, the Psalms, other prophets, the shepherds at Christmas, Jesus, Peter, and finally Paul. He spoke of the complete revelation as given to us in the New Testament, and finally, the complete revelation of the missionary idea in the work of the early church. Although the concept of missionary work finds ample support in the New Testament, it seems like a bit of a stretch to view someone like Abraham as foreshadowing Christian missions in his travels. But the understanding of progressive revelation is characteristic of this era. It is the Rosetta Stone for understanding much of Canadian biblical scholarship at the turn of the century. One relevant example is also Knox professor John Edgar McFadyen's book, Old Testament Criticism and the Christian Church. It provides a portrayal of biblical criticism that nonetheless presupposes an explicitly Christian and Protestant theological framework. He defines biblical criticism as the free and reverent study of all the biblical facts. He writes that a reverent spirit will inspire the critic. And he believed that a proper critic will not focus on errors and discrepancies, but only under the constraint of scientific necessity. McFadyen conceives of biblical criticism as a task primarily in the service of Christian theology that is to be carried out reverently. Again, biblical criticism in the era was in the service of Christian apologetics. He understands even finding discrepancies and contradictions in the Bible to be in the service of understanding progressive revelation when it is used. Although he acknowledges not all criticism does this, McFadyen says the specific object of biblical criticism is to put us in possession of the mind and spirit of the men who wrote the Bible, to help us understand the history in which they took part, and which they and their books helped to mold, and to make plain the divine purpose which unfolded itself in the history. Again, he thinks it is part of the critic's task to show how God's purpose is progressively revealed in Scripture. He believed all criticism should ultimately edify, and he was one of the most advanced higher critics in Canada of his era. He concludes the overall effect of biblical criticism is to make it clear that revelation was progressive, that this kind of revelation led human beings as a father leads his child. He believed that skeptical attacks on the Bible on moral and scientific grounds can be refuted by emphasizing the revelation as, on the one hand, ethical or religious, and on the other hand, historical and progressive. He believed this concept of revelation eliminates any objections to the Bible based on the contents of Noah's Ark, or the ages of the patriarchs, or King David's moral failings. It's not an accident that progressive revelation, in its theological approach to the Bible, applied the logic of Darwinian evolution to the Bible. And at times, this was done very consciously by its practitioners, because evolution and was being applied to much more than biology, but also social dynamics and other areas of life in that era. These types of presuppositions can even be found in Julius Wellhausen's source-critical reconstructions of the Pentateuch, which parallels biological evolution in its gradual construction of Israelite history. So in 1903, the English scholar J. Estlin Carpenter wrote that for New Testament scholars, the efforts of the last generation have been occupied with determining how far and in what manner the origins of Christianity can be brought into connection with the principle of evolution. But here's the thing. The doctrine of progressive revelation, and specifically with these versions tied to evolution, became mixed with a denigration of Judaism that fed into the anti-Semitism of the era. anti-Semitic rhetoric became inextricably linked with maintaining a Christian theology that incorporated the insights and challenges of higher criticism, because it involved, at times, downplaying earlier parts of the Bible. It led scholars to interpret Scripture on an evolutionary scheme that ultimately portrayed Israelite religion or Judaism as an incomplete step in the evolutionary process leading to Christianity. Like the difference between human beings and the ancient primate, Australopithecus afarensis. Speaking of anti-Semitism, one prominent Canadian once wrote in his journal that a friend of his endorsed the idea that the Jews were poison in the veins of a community. The man who wrote these words in his journal was Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King. And the friend who endorsed this idea was the principal of this college, Thomas Aiken. Thomas Aiken was very close friends with Mackenzie King. And I've read all of Aiken's sermons and his works, and characteristic of the era, you can find progressive revelation in them everywhere, and also mixed with his views of Judaism. In the same era that Aiken was saying things like this to his friend Mackenzie King, Canada was not letting Jewish refugees into the country, or they made it hard for European Jews to enter, despite the Nazi genocide of the Jewish people. It's been estimated that the country may have saved 50,000, 100,000, and possibly even 200,000 of the people who lost their lives in the Nazi gas chambers. King and Aiken were close friends, though of course King's anti-Semitism had a variety of influences. Nonetheless, we see that biblical scholarship is not just an academic, affects more than just scholars. But in the end, the state of biblical scholarship was tied to the dominant culture in Canada. Nonetheless, although that Minister G.D. Baines compared higher criticism to a bicycle that might or might not take someone to church on Sunday, much later there would come a day when Sunday bicycle riding and biblical scholarship would be carried out in Canada by people with little concern for the church's beliefs at all. Thank you.